Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to talk about quality, which is going both strength and dexterity. It's technically not a thing in either Dark Souls or Dark Souls 2. It's a weapon upgrade path that originated in Demon Souls. And to be quite honest, quality is really kind of not a thing in practice. You end up spending more points for less damage, no matter what weapons you try to use. So for that reason, I'm not going to go over the typical upsides, downsides type stuff. I will instead go over the interesting weapons with large amounts of scaling in both strength and dexterity. This is also a great opportunity for me to talk about the Covenant of Champions, which is the hard mode Covenant. It can be joined via the stone in Majula. The specific modifiers of the Covenant vary from enemy to enemy, but the general theme is that the enemies have higher defenses, more HP, and significantly higher damage. It also causes NPC invaders and certain enemies to drop Stones, which can be traded in for Covenant-specific rewards. More on those later. It also prevents you from summoning White Phantoms, either other players or NPC summons. This makes a small number of bosses quite a bit harder. It's not that tricky though, assuming you have a good grasp of the bosses themselves. But you'll still notice the damage that you take. It's quite a bit higher, there's no doubt about it. Starting the game, I went with Scholar of the First Sin, which will be useful for Covenant of Champions. While I'm doing the Covenant, I thought I'd also go ahead and start as Deprived with no gift as well. This is actually a pretty significant handicap, even more so than Covenant of Champions in the early part of the game. In Dark Souls, Deprived is actually pretty serviceable and is a well-rounded starting class. In Dark Souls 2, Deprived is strictly worse than all the other starting classes, starting with an abysmal 6 in each stat. This prevents you from using nearly any weapon or spell to start with, and you also start with no items at all, including the 10 life gems that all the other classes start with. For these reasons, I think that you basically have to farm souls to get the ball rolling. So we'll start by going to Hyde's Tower of Flame because the Dragon Rider can be killed by luring him off the edge of his arena. I'm not going to go over that here, but there's a ton of footage of the trick since it's relevant in speedruns. Once you have his souls, you can start looking at the weapon options you have. My choice for the early game was the Caestus. This is a very underwhelming weapon, but it does have extreme scaling in both strength and dexterity. However, power stancing 2 Caestuses is pretty easy to accomplish, as you'll only need around 15 strength and 11 dexterity. Once I had those ready to go, I opted to farm more souls. My choice for this was to farm the Greatsword Old Knight after the Dragon Rider. The main reason to do this is that he's very weak to strike damage, so the Caestuses are good, and also he has a chance to drop Stones, which will come in handy later. As for the Caestuses themselves, they're cool in theory, but actually quite terrible. The scaling is good, but the base damage is especially poor. They also have an extremely awkward hitbox, making them arbitrarily bad in some scenarios or against certain enemies or bosses. With that being said, they're decent in the early stage of the game, firstly because they can be easily power stanced. Also, their high scaling is most effective up until the first soft cap, meaning a character with 20 strength and 20 dexterity is actually getting pretty solid scaling out of them. They're still useless by the end of the game, but they aren't strictly useless. The next weapon I think is worth noting is the Grand Lance. This is another lance weapon, some of my personal favorites in the game. It can be found in the Forest of Fallen Giants near the King's Gate. The strength and dexterity requirements are a little high, but it's still so useful that I recommend it. The scaling is also fairly poor, being split evenly between strength and dexterity. It would probably be more effective elementally infused, but the ability to consistently knock enemies down makes it useful in a way that defies its average performance on paper. A great option for practically any kind of character. Next is the Arced Sword. This can be obtained by trading in the Flexile Sentry Soul with Strayed. Alternatively, you can buy the Murakumo from Ornifex. They're roughly the same. This weapon can easily knock down enemies with the R2, which is pretty nice, although the range isn't particularly long. Against certain enemies that don't get knocked down, this R2 also sets up for a critical. A great example is the Hyde Knights. The nicer thing about these weapons is decent scaling and high damage, meaning the weapon is fairly serviceable. It's really not a quality weapon, it's actually just a dexterity weapon, so there's not much gain from having really high strength, but it's another interesting weapon. Even better is the next weapon, the Zweihander. It can be found in the Iron Keep, in the area where the Dull Ember can be found in the original game. Its longer range and ability to knock enemies down makes it extremely useful, the best of the items I've gone over so far. The main downside are slightly lower damage, but the ability to control enemies makes it a practical weapon for basically any type of character. Even at 50 strength, 50 dexterity, the damage is only passable, and in reality it probably does a lot better with an elemental infusion, just like all of these weapons. However, again, extremely good at controlling average enemies. Okay, that covers the really interesting weapons for the first half of the game. Next, I'm going to finally talk about the reason for the Covenant of Champions, that being the Vanquisher seal. Obtaining it is actually quite difficult. You must offer 50 Awe Stones to the Champion Stone in Majula. These are sometimes dropped by various enemies, especially kind of difficult ones, such as the Ogre and the Forest of Fallen Giants. For time reasons, however, you'll probably want to farm these from NPC invaders, since they're guaranteed to drop at least one. As you go through the game, you can actually obtain a decent number just by making sure you kill any NPC invaders you encounter, as well as those enemies which have a chance to drop it. As for actually farming the rest of the necessary Awe Stones, as far as I can tell, the easiest one is the NPC invader in the upstairs area of Grave of the Saints. Note that supposedly he only spawns when playing offline. There's a couple of advantages to this NPC invader. He's relatively weak compared to other NPC invaders, even in New Game Plus, meaning he can be farmed easily. I did it by poisoning him with arrows. He can also be knocked off the edge of the bridge consistently. Not sure how exactly, but in theory that's the easiest way to do it. After you kill him the first time, he can only be respawned by burning a bonfire ascetic, and this is where Scholar of the First Sin comes in, because he will spawn indefinitely after only burning a single bonfire ascetic. And not only is he guaranteed to drop at least one Awe Stone, but he also has a decent chance to drop a second one as well, so I'd equip some item discovery items as well. Now that you've farmed 50 Awe Stones, you can give them all to the rock, one at a time. Is it worth it? Basically no. The ring has okay scaling, and is noticeably stronger when power stanced than power stance Caestus. However, it still has the same terrible hitbox, and even on a character with extremely high strength and dexterity, it still does noticeably less damage than some of your other options. It also takes up a ring slot, which is much less than ideal. The ring is lighter than most weapons, but in my opinion, weight isn't really too much of an issue in this game. And it doesn't even scale especially well. The strength scaling is not especially impressive, it's like 75, and the dexterity scaling is quite bad as well, so it's not even an ideal choice for a character with really high strength and dexterity. It's not strictly useless, but a highly disappointing weapon, and I kind of expected it to do ridiculous DPS or something, and it did not. Among quote-unquote quality weapons, as far as I can tell, one of the best is the Curved Dragon Greatsword. This can be obtained by trading in the Ancient Dragon Soul with Ornifex, and that can be obtained by returning to the Duke's Dear Freya boss arena after obtaining the Ashen Mist Heart. Not unlike the Arc Sword, this weapon deals solid damage and has extremely good scaling with dexterity, as well as good scaling and strength. The R2 is a ranged shockwave which consumes durability, and this could be useful against some average enemies. The slash damage type is less than ideal, but it's one of the better options you have just because of the sheer damage. You could hypothetically power stance it with a weapon such as the Arc Sword, but you'd probably want high stamina and good defenses to be able to get away with that. So assuming high strength and dexterity, that's fairly impractical. Next up is the Yorg Spear. This can be obtained by trading in Sin's Soul with Ornifex. A very odd weapon, the damage isn't that impressive, even with high strength and dexterity. However, the R1 into R1 combo can actually do a surprisingly good amount of damage. It's very interesting. Unfortunately, that's quite difficult to pull off against bosses, so it's maybe not a great option. You could power stance it with the Grand Lance, and with the old Leo Ring, the damage would be serviceable. Unfortunately, Yorg Spear also comes with a debuff that makes you weaker to all forms of elemental damage, making the weapon of dubious value. Lots of the DLC bosses have elemental damage. An interesting option, but not better than your other choices in my opinion. Like most of these weapons, it's probably better off when elementally infused. Anyway, I've talked about a bunch of boss weapons, so the question becomes, how do you farm tons of petrified dragon bones? Well, turns out there's a really easy way to farm them, at least in Scholar of the First Sin. There's a petrified dragon bone in the courtyard of Aldea's Keep, which means you can actually easily farm infinite petrified dragon bones. Just burn an ascetic in the courtyard bonfire. If you run out of ascetics, you can also farm them here in Aldea's Keep from one of the petrified hollows at the top of the stairs. That particular hollow will always drop 2, meaning you can farm infinite ascetics here, and merely by walking into the door to the next area, you can also despawn the NPC invader as well. So upgrading boss weapons isn't as bad as it might seem. Okay, I've gone over a bunch of decent weapons. Tragically, in my opinion, none of these are better than the Zweihander, at least in terms of controlling average enemies. None of these weapons are even good at killing bosses, even with high strength and dexterity. Tragically, power stance thrusting swords with old Leo Ring are pretty obviously just better than any of these options, even when they are power stanced, since the tendency to get multiple attacks out of thrusting swords is simply too strong. Rapiers, estocs, and the Espada Ropera are just always going to perform much better. One last thrusting sword I haven't mentioned is the Ice Rapier. This one drops from enemies in Frozen Aleum Lois, and it's technically a rare drop, but seems fairly common. This is perhaps the strongest thrusting sword in the game, assuming high strength and dexterity, and has long range as well as bleed. It also supposedly is really good when elementally infused. The only other weapon which can compete with thrusting swords in the so-called quality space is the Twinblade, which I already mentioned in the mundane video. The really nice thing about this weapon, and why I think it's on the same level as power stance thrusting swords, is it's actually stronger in the frigid outskirts, which is probably the hardest area in the game, especially in Covenant of Champions. To reiterate, you can't summon white phantoms, which is generally the easiest way to beat the area. The nice thing about the Twinblade is that it can stun lock the stupid horsies, and depending on your stamina, you could probably kill them in a single stun lock. It also is a really good weapon against the boss, since it can attack quickly, does good damage, and is a better choice than thrusting swords, which can sometimes miss the boss due to the boss's awkward hitbox. Lastly, I'll talk about bows and arrows. If you have high dexterity, there's really no reason not to use them. The main question is whether or not great bows are good. The best one seems to be the Dragon Slayer Great Bow, which can be obtained by beating Old Iron King after burning a bonfire ascetic, and then trading in the Old King Soul with Ornifex. Honestly, I think it's terrible, even with absurdly high strength and dexterity. The arrows are expensive, they do a surprisingly low damage, and it doesn't seem to even knock enemies down, making the weapon laughably bad. Instead, you should use a normal bow and arrow, which will allow you to make use of poison arrows. I use the compound bow, since it has both strength and dexterity scaling, but I doubt that it's better in any way over the Hunter's Black Bow, but the results are probably relatively similar. Okay, so there's Quality, Covenant of Champions, and Deprived kind of rolled all into one. Again, this has purely been a challenge character, and the game doesn't really have support for Quality as a strategy. For sheer DPS, probably the best option is to increase either Intelligence or Faith, and then to elementally infuse the weapon, and that will almost certainly get you better results once the weapon has been buffed. But it's a great opportunity to go over some strange and unusual weapons that this game has to offer in terms of whether or not they're good to use. I definitely missed some, like the Bone Fist. That's a pretty interesting weapon, but I covered a good number of them. In short, mostly just the Zweihander. I highly recommend the Zweihander if you have like a weird character and you don't know what weapon to use. The Zweihander is really great, and it's especially good against average enemies. So thanks for watching.